Good evening and welcome to Webinar 3 of our Education Awareness series brought to you by Edunity Foundation, G25 and BFM. Now, we started this series with an overview of our education system, the challenges and even possible solutions with very passionate people from LEAPED, Teach for Malaysia and PAGE. Thursday last week, we spoke to Dato Sri Idris Jalla and Chen Li Kai about the thinking behind the blueprint and its challenges. Today, we will explore the implementation of the Malaysia Education Blueprint from the government's perspective. Two ladies joining me today, both formerly from the government sector. Dato Dr. Habiba Abdul Rahman, she's the former Director General of Education. Welcome, Dr. Habiba. How are you today?
Fine, thank you.
And Puan Khadijah Abdullah, former CEO of PADU. PADU is actually the Education Performance and Delivery Unit. Welcome, Puan Khadijah. How are you today?
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, ladies. Dr. Habiba, I'm going to kickstart this conversation, but before that, if you have a question, post it in the comment section, and we'll try and answer as many questions as possible. This webinar is probably going to run for about an hour, so you want to start sending those questions right now. This is all about the implementation of the Malaysia Education Blueprint. Dr. Habiba, you started your service in education in 1986. You were appointed the Director General position at the Ministry of Education in January 2020. Perfect timing because the pandemic hit very soon after. And you were the ministry's 17th Director General and the second woman to helm this post. What were your immediate observations in relation to the implementation of the Malaysia Education Blueprint when you took office in 2020?
As we all know, that the Malaysia Education Blueprint is a 13-year journey for us to go through the transformation to bring our education system to meet standards at international level, rising expectations, meeting demands of parents and the society and what they expect from education itself. So 2020, when I went into office as the Director General of Education, was already the final year of the second wave of the blueprint because the 13-year journey of the Malaysia Education Blueprint is phased out into 3 waves, as we know. The first wave is to turn around the system. The second wave is to accelerate improvement. And the third wave is to bring about greater excellence as well as flexibility. Thus, we know that for every wave, there's a specific purpose on how the journey goes. Any shortfall in meeting the purposes would mean shortfall in the transformation as well as meeting the aspirations. So we know from our review as well as projections that in 2020, there's already successes, that there's already indication that we'll be meeting targets. But there's also indication that we will not be meeting some of the targets. So this means that 2020 is an important year if we want to re-strategize in order to meet the end of wave 2 targets. To come as close as possible to the target set so that we can move on into wave 3 more readily. So that would be a challenge for the ministry because you have this 1 year and and going into office at that final, year of wave 2 is a huge challenge for me. The second challenge is in the first 100 days of going into office, there were rapid changes in the leadership at the government as well as at the ministry level. We see 4 ministers of education during that 100 days. 2 of them were the prime ministers at that time. So changes in leadership bring about different priorities, different ways of working, and how would we as the civil service provide support as best as possible to meet the various demands and needs of the changes in leadership. The third would be the challenge brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. As we know, when MCO was announced on 18th of March, schools were on holiday. But 2 weeks later, when MCO was extended, children must continue to learn regardless whether they are in school or they are at home. Thus, because the MCO was extended, so learning had to continue at home. So that brought about home-based learning or remote learning, and that tests the readiness of our students, teachers, as well as parents because they are now at home. So the teachers are with them, but only perhaps virtually, or or through modules or worksheets that are being sent to them and returned later. So that requires a lot of support at home from parents itself. So that tests our readiness on home-based learning. And at the same time, we know that the younger children have more difficulty. Thus, what about the acquisition of basic literacy and numerous skills? What about those students are more challenged? For instance, the special education needs children without the expert support as well as the available equipments and tools required for them to continue learning. So in a way, that brings about issues with regards to loss of learning. It may also bring about widening of learning gaps and achievement gaps that's already in existence within the education system. So these challenges may somehow affect and has implications on how we bring about and how we reassess on how we can proceed with the delivery of the Malaysia Education Blueprint.
I'll come back to you, Dr. Habiba, but Puan Khadija, what was the role of PADU, the Education Performance and Delivery Unit? Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. What was the role of PADU?
Okay, the role of PADU. I think before I go into the role of PADU, it would be useful, if I may, to go back into history. You see, the establishment of PADU was actually enshrined in the blueprint itself. So if you were to look into the document, it is in chapter 8, page 10 to 11. So the blueprint, as we all know, was actually approved by the cabinet and also endorsed by the Conference of Rulers. This was, I think, early 2013. So it has a very strong mandate. Therefore, because the establishment of PADU is enshrined in the blueprint, therefore it comes together. Therefore, the mandate of its establishment was very strong. And that mandate is then translated into the Memorandum of Association for the PADU organization. So I think we try our best at that point in time, and I think currently it's also being done. One of our key roles is to help solve problems. So we try to find out what are some of the problems and try to find solutions. And we also escalate some of these problems upwards if it requires, process changes or policy changes. So that's one. We also help to create transparency by having rigorous monitoring on the implementation and on the performance. And this is important because, one of the key features of the blueprint is the focus on implementation. So that is why PADU was seen as an important unit. I think if I may refer to what Lee Kai said in the last webinar, research has shown that a lot of transformation initiatives, 70% actually fail because they do not have that focus, the implementation focus. So that's one of the key features of the blueprint itself. Therefore, PADU was created or established to ensure that there is that rigor and discipline of monitoring the progress of all the initiatives that have been planned. The other one is stakeholder engagement. We do a lot of stakeholder engagement together, of course, with the ministry, in both internal as well as external. And we work very closely with with the ministry because PADU is just playing a supporting role. At the end of the day, the accountability of the deliverables actually rests with the ministry. So we work very closely, and I'm very, very grateful. We had very strong support along the way. Of course, we had some challenges as well. And then many of the engagement involve a lot of discussion with our colleagues in the ministry. The other one is cross-team cooperation and collaboration. So sometimes it helps to have PADU as an independent body, independent unit to come in and to facilitate the discussion and the collaboration across teams. And therefore, we played a role in trying to provide the focus, the discipline, and also in a way help to contribute in terms of work culture change, how to do things more efficiently, how to do things in a very disciplined manner, how to solve problems. But of course, all this is in full engagement with the ministry officers together as a team. We work on this. So so that's basically the main roles of PADU. Thank you.
Puan Khadija, I've been reading, I was just reading, and please correct me if I'm wrong, some reports that have said that there was an overlap of work of PADU with the long-established Education Planning and Policy Research Division. Did you feel that that was the case?
I personally don't think so, because we play complementary role and supportive role. I think there was a misconception because our focus is very much program management. The EPRD is a very busy unit because they do a lot of policies, and they look at a lot of the operations within the ministry. So you need PADU as a separate unit to support and to to help in terms of looking at certain things from a different perspective and different lenses. So so this overlap actually I think is a misconception. We've been working quite well with EPRD. Of course, sometimes there is blurring of lines, and that needed a lot of, like I said, engagement and discussion. We do sometimes have challenges, but so far we were able to resolve and overcome those challenges.
I'm very interested. You said PADU was an independent unit. Did you think you had the autonomy to run PADU the way you wanted to? And were you able to achieve what you wanted to achieve?
One of the challenges I think that we have is the lack of authority. I think that's quite obvious. Therefore, it affected sometimes the speed of how we want to move things, because we need to go back to get a lot of layers of approvals on certain matters. So if certain level of authority is given, probably that would be able to help us to move things faster.
And, Puan Khadija, I think your biggest challenge in PADU was time. People wanted to see change in a short period of time. We know we always look to Norway as, a success story when it comes to education reform, but it took them 40 years. You had very few years to actually implement. What are your thoughts on that? How did you manage expectations when it came to time?
I think you're right. I use this analogy of a huge tanker because Ministry of Education is so huge, like this Titanic, and Padu is like a small little tiny propeller trying to steer this behemoth kind of a structure to turn around. So yes, it's not easy. It's a great challenge, and speed is definitely an issue. But despite that, I think we have done quite well together with the ministry. As you can see, because part of what I said earlier, we try to create transparency. We produce the annual report from the very beginning. I think at the moment, if I'm not mistaken, there have been 8 annual reports. So every year we produce the annual report to share with the rakyat what were the achievements, what were the shortfalls, what were the plans in order to overcome those shortfalls. Sometimes those shortfalls are things that's beyond our control. And it's there for everybody to read. In fact, coincidentally, I think the latest annual report was for 2020 was launched, or rather was uploaded last week. I think it was published last week. So I would encourage everybody to read. And you can go to Padu's website, www.padu.moe.my, and you can find the annual report. And if you want to look at some of the achievements, a summary of Wave 2, you can look at page 85 onwards. So it gives you a good summary of some of the achievements. So in short, as much as there are a lot of challenges and not everything achieve its targets, but generally there are also a lot of achievements that we can celebrate, that we can be proud of despite the challenges. So
Dr. Habiba?
sometimes, if I may
That's
just
okay.
say that sometimes we just need this positive booster for us to celebrate. Thank you.
Dr. Habiba, did you have the autonomy to do very much in the very short time that you were there? Was it 15 months?
Right. I think the Malaysia Education Blueprint is quite clear in terms of what it wants to achieve. And we've already set certain work processes on how to go about achieving that. Thus, every year we review the initiatives and how far we have achieved in terms of the targets for those initiatives. And these initiatives are aligned to each of the system aspiration. So for instance, in 2020, there are 17 initiatives, and these 17 initiatives are spread across the 5 system aspirations. Some of the system aspirations has got a lot more as compared to others, but each of these initiatives will contribute somewhat in achieving those aspirations. So I suppose in terms of autonomy, I think it's more of setting, agreeing, negotiating on what those initiatives are and the targets that they are supposed to meet for particular year before it's reviewed, and you come up with how do you then re-strategize for the following year. So in a way, it's not a matter of autonomy, but more on negotiations and how best you strategize in meeting those annual targets in order to achieve the larger macro targets in the long run.
Farida Stevens is asking, last Thursday, Idris Jalla mentioned that there was a silent revolution through the ranking and banding system of all schools that was started. So why did they stop that after 3 years if it was working to make schools improve themselves? Dr. Habiba?
So I think the way I see it is that the ranking or the through the banding of schools is meant to understand the performance of the schools and to provide the necessary support. Whether you are in the better bands, still you can improve and you can accelerate in terms of your performance. But if you are in the lower bands, what kind of support that's required for those kind of schools? However, in the process itself, it's mixed with other things. For instance, the bands are also used to reward schools, reward teachers and others within the school. So in a way, it detracts the original purpose of why the schools are, why you rank or you ban them. So I think some started to even game on how the banding comes about and how to obtain the incentive from the system. So I think people may remember about the bai'ah, which is the reward given to schools that show improvements. So I think that when the original purpose is mixed with other things, then it detracts from the original intent that is good. So I guess after 3 years, we also had issues with how do you measure the band. Somehow it overlaps. For instance, you use achievement. You also use other measures, which is not really objective. So that again questions on how you come about with the band.
So last week again, and Malik Ali is asking, Idris Jala, I think he's messed up everything for you ladies because he's got a lot of follow-up questions from Idris. But he also mentioned last Thursday that a key recommendation that of banding of schools in terms of performance has been disbanded, and which is the UPSR exams. Is it hard to reinstate now that UPSR has been abolished? And as you said, Dr. Habiba, is UPSR the only gauge when it comes to bands and how they're actually doing?
I think when the ministry announced about the abolishment of the UPSR, they also mentioned about the school-based assessment. So that was already after my tenure as the DG of Education. But I guess the ministry needs to now outline how are they going to improve that school-based assessment if it's going to be used to gauge the performance of schools. Because school-based assessment has got various purposes. It's usually used within the classroom so that we can gauge the performance of our students within the class so that we can provide support to improve further their performance. But when we want to use it across classes, across schools at a national level, then it has to be moderated so that we can compare the school-based assessment from one to another. So I think the ministry needs to work out on how best they can go about doing it. I'm sure that they have already planned out such things. For instance, they have told me about items that teachers can reach out so it can be fixed according to certain framework and standards that set by the ministry, or even though it is run through school-based. So we have yet to see how that will be managed. But it's interesting actually when you speak about the UPSR, and it's not a matter of just looking at the banding performance, but also, for instance, when you, it's also used as a measure in looking at how you narrow the gap at the primary level between urban and rural schools, between gender and SES, socioeconomic status. So if we see at the trend, we are doing much better at the secondary level using the SPM. But at the primary level, we see that in the first 3 years, which means the first wave of the blueprint implementation, there is an obvious narrowing of gap. But after the 3 years, the gap started to widen. So that brings to question the sustainability of whatever that we put in place in terms of trying to narrow the gap. So I think it's beyond just looking at the measure, but in the delivery of the blueprint, we have to set in mind what's our target. So we want to narrow that gap. For instance, yes, you want to improve performance, and at the same time, you want to narrow that gap. So that means it's not just the measure, but what do we do in terms of providing that support to narrow that gap?
And do you think, and so what are some of these widening gaps besides what you've just mentioned? And what are the ones that are closing? And how do we decide which is important? Either one of you ladies, Puan Khadijah, Dr. Habibah. Puan Khadijah, would you like to take this one?
I think if you look at the latest report, across socio-economic gap, gender gap, urban-rural gap, there is a narrowing of the gap. So that's positive. In between, of course, there's fluctuation. Certain years there's widening, certain years there's, but if you look at from, I think if I'm not mistaken, urban-rural, we started much earlier. So if you compare 2013, I think up to 2020, there is narrowing of the gap. But gender, I think we started a bit later. I'm not sure, if I'm not mistaken, 2016. And then social economy also, I think 2016, 2017. So I feel encouraged. It's not an easy journey, but I know for a fact that the ministry is always looking at what interventions that we can do to further enhance so that we achieve these aspirations.
Have we achieved it at all?
It's not there yet, yeah, but it's always good to, I think, to look at the fact that it is improving. Just like also PISA, I think we mentioned this during the last webinar. Yes, it's not at the standard that we want, but the good news is it's improving. So if we can maintain that, God willing, we will be there.
I think, yes, go ahead, Dr. Habibah.
I agree that, there has been successes. So it's good to see that there have been improvements. For instance, if we look at the gaps across these three groups, urban, rural, gender, as well as socioeconomic status, it's good to see that it's positive that there is a narrowing of the gap. But then again, when we talk about the blueprint, it's very important that we are on track. So it's good to know that there is a narrowing, but has the narrowing been fast enough? For instance, we are targeting for wave 2 a narrowing of 50% compared when we started with the blueprint, a narrowing of 50% by 2020. But looking at the annual report, we have only narrowed by 38%. That means we've not achieved. We are short of that 50% target. And although we have also started the initiatives on narrowing gaps by gender and SES, but the target set is 25% by 2020. And we see that for gender, we've only narrowed it by 8%. And for SES is 0.2%. So that's very far from what is expected in the efforts that the ministry is doing in narrowing the gaps. Because ultimately, it's not a matter of just looking at the numbers, but how inclusive are we in providing education for all our students? The gap means that we are not meeting the needs, we are not giving a fair, the equitable equity to some of our children. So that's the important part. It's beyond meeting the targets, but also meeting the provision of education for different groups of students.
What will it take to speed up this whole process, Dr. Habibah, Puan Khadijah? As I'm listening, I'm already getting so impatient that we're losing generations of children who are being deprived of a good education. We've had the blueprint there. We're not moving fast enough. What do you think it will take for us to start moving even faster? Or what were some of the big challenges that didn't allow us to move fast enough, Dr. Habibah?
I think there are various initiatives, but one of which I thought was really good at the beginning of the blueprint was the district transformation program, where we have changed the role of the district from purely administrative purpose to one that supports the school more, so that we can accelerate improvements of schools. This we have seen. If earlier you mentioned that 70% of transformation fails.
Yeah.
So what are some of the lessons learned from those systems that have succeeded? So I think one of it is that they have leveraged on those offices that are closest to the schools to support them. The ministry is further away from the schools, so are the JPNs, but the district office is the closest to the schools. So they should play that role in supporting the school. And it's also supports the notion that we do not want a one size fits all solution, because there are variations in the performance across states, across districts, across schools, within states and within districts. So it has to be more tailored. It has to be differentiated according to the root causes and how we understand the challenges and issues that is at the local situation. So the DTP brings about those advantages. You are closer to the school, you understand the school, you may do the analysis using evidence based on how you can tailor your support based on the understanding of the challenges that the schools are facing. So that would help to address the issues schools are facing and help them in terms of performance. If we can raise the performance of schools, definitely the gap would narrow. But if we look at the trend, most of the time, the trend follows a certain pattern. If urban improves, rural would improve, but how much does the rural improve? So it will only narrow if the rural schools are performing way better than the urban schools. So in that sense, how can we provide that support to such schools? I'm not saying that all rural schools are not doing well. I think Idris Jalla did mention some examples like Ulu Lubai. I think there are also others like Bakalalan, which we have seen very good examples of, even with challenging situations, they can overcome them, and still students are performing. So I think it's possible. We have seen examples during our education review how certain states can bring about very rapid improvement in terms of performance of their schools, even within the existing system with the same processes and procedures as other states are performing. So these are things which, other states and districts can learn and perhaps tailor to their own needs, tailor to their own context. Then only I think the initiative on narrowing the gap would work.
Are you saying that's not happening, or that's not happening enough at the moment? Looks like they're empowered. They're all empowered, but is it happening up to the expectations that we expect?
If we design,
sorry. Why don't Khadija? Why don't you go first?
No. I think you see, this is a journey, right? So quite a lot of the time, as I echo what Dr. Habibah said earlier, there's a lot of lesson learned as you go along, and as you move along. So the lessons learned will help us to make things better. So quite a lot of the initiatives, probably it started a bit slow because we were still grappling with the issues and all that. But then once you get it, then it accelerated. The other thing is also data. I think one of the weaknesses that we had initially was the lack of very good data. So it took us a long time to gather data, to do proper data analytics, so that we can make informed decision on a lot of things across the ministry. To give you an example, even like dilapidated schools, all these schools that need repairs and all that. It took us quite a number of years, I think, firstly to get the data, then to structure the data, then to work with another external, I think JKR, if I'm not mistaken, because they already have a proper system before we can actually execute very accurate budgeting and also the repairs and upgrading that we needed. So data is one of the areas, and then of course the IT, the IT connectivity and all that. So all these, I think, are being done at the moment. Yeah. So we started earlier with a lot of issues, but we learned and we improved on it, and hopefully, I think moving forward, things will be much faster.
Dr. Habiba, do you want to chime in on that?
I agree that data evidence is very important. That's how you can understand the issues and challenges and the root causes of why this is happening, and to provide the relevant or right support for the schools. But I think when you mentioned about empowerment, I guess many use empowerment as a reason, but do not actually understand what is empowered to them. There are many things within the boundaries that can still be managed at the district as well as at the school level. That's why we can see it happening in some states and districts. So it's also the understanding of the empowerment that's given to you and how well you use that empowerment. And when we say that, you know, you need to use data, then you can tailor, then you can understand the root causes and tailor the intervention, whether, you know, there is that capability among the people at the district as well at the school level. So I think that again would also cause the intervention that you do, whether it's the most suitable for the particular school in order to bring about that improvement in performance. For instance, in the district transformation program, in the first wave, because the restructuring of the whole district education office would take time, because it requires planning, it requires approval from central agency. So what was done at the early stage was to put in the resources that would enable the district to support school, which is the school improvement specialist coaches to help coach teachers, and the school improvement partners to help support school leadership. But as we move from wave 1 to wave 2, the whole district has to transform into supporting schools, because they are now restructured with new functions. Because of the function, that's why you have this new structure. So that function is to support the schools. But if the district is still relying on just the SISC Plus or the SI Partner Plus, and not the whole district is supporting the schools, especially the most challenged school, then there would be a shortfall there. Likewise, if the people within the district and the school, because you also need to do performance dialogue so that you can understand the issues, challenges, follow through with action, how well the action has been implemented, and bring about results. If there is limitations in terms of the ability to do that, then again, the right support may not necessarily be given to the schools. And that's why we see perhaps some schools are improving and some schools are still remaining and not shown any great improvements.
Puan Khadija?
The underlying element across all that we have mentioned is quality. Like even data, you need quality data. Even teaching and learning, you need quality teaching and learning. Administration, you need quality administration. So all that that Dato has mentioned, I agree. But I think it all revolves around quality. Even the role of teachers, not just about teaching and learning. But now, there are teachers in school having roles like counseling teachers, discipline teachers, right? So to what extent they are of quality? So that needs to be reviewed and assessed. because especially now, children in school having a lot of mental health issues and stuff like that. So they need to constantly be equipped with quality training, updated information, and doing things efficiently across the board in all segments and in all activities. So I think that cuts across. So that's just the thing that I wanted to add in.
Dr. Habiba, you served as Director General for just a year, January 2020 to April 2021. The system of DGs coming in for a short tenure before they retire is not exactly the best for transformation. What is the role of the DG in the delivery of an effective education system, and what happens when you have DGs coming and going in such short periods of time? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I guess let me start with the challenge I face. Firstly, I think when I went into office, I need to show what can I do within my 100 days in office. What kind of quick wins that I can do. But then again, after that 100 days with the COVID situation, I'm already in the next 100 days to exit. Even exit requires effort in how can you exit well from the system, because you're handing over the post to the next DG. So you cannot leave, a lot of things, unanswered or unattended. So that was to me a great challenge. How do you ramp up and then suddenly you need to leave? So I think because we have the blueprint, so I was part and parcel of the education review process, part of developing the blueprint. I had a short time in Padu as well, in the delivery process. And then when I was in EPRD, there were also initiatives where EPRD owned them. So I had a range of experiences in handling the blueprint and its initiatives. So being the DG and in the short period of time, I thought, okay, what can I do best in supporting the blueprint? So in my inaugural speech as the Director General of Education, I leveraged on the blueprint and focused on the things which I thought was the most important. Because when we look at an education system, as rightly put by Puan Khadijah, the foundation is quality of education. So how best can I support bringing about the quality? So I focused on the schools, because whatever the ministry does, the JPN does, or the district does, ultimately what people see as the quality of the education system is the product from the school. So for me, the most important is the student participation. They need to participate in education. And when they do, they need to learn. So participation, learning is important for me. And who is responsible for that? So the most important factor is, of course, the teachers and the school leaders. And they are supported by the district as well as the JPN. But most importantly for me is quality teachers as well as the quality school leaders that can bring about that transformation. And of course, fourthly, although I put as assessment, but then again, it's not a matter of just handling or conducting the assessment, but then how do we use data from that assessment to inform us on how to improve the learning itself. So those were the four key components that I focused upon as the Director General of Education during my short tenure. So it doesn't run away from what we aspire in the Malaysia Education Blueprint. So when I leave, I hope that, the blueprint being there, for 13 years, although we only have less than 5 years left, the next Director General will also carry it forward. But then again, speaking of Director General, I think it's certainly not easy to do much changes during if it is such a short duration of time. So I think in the longer run, the ministry needs to see how it can best do its succession planning, particularly for key leadership positions, because it's not easy for someone to go into position without that proper development to take on board the particular post. It involves 10,000 schools. It involves 5 million children. It involves 440,000 teachers, besides those in the ministry and so on. So I think it's a huge task upon the Director General if it is just a short period of time. So for me, the succession planning, the development into those positions are important, key for the ministry to look into going forward.
Then you worked with 4 ministers of education in a period of 100 days. How does that play out when it comes to transformation? Or are we saying then the blueprint is there, doesn't really matter who the Minister of Education is, because really the people who are empowered and making the change are people at the district level, the teachers, the principals, the students?
I think being a civil service, only that I am in the education sector, we need to support the leadership, the current government. So when YB, Dr. Mazli Malik left, we know his focus areas. He's more on zero reject policy, zero dropout, because he had more time as the Minister of Education. But when Yang Amat Berhormat Dr. Mahathir came, he had his own priorities. He wanted to focus a lot on English, on STEM, on bringing back science and mathematics in English, on values, on financial literacy. So those were some of the focuses which he brought forth when he was acting Minister of Education, besides being the PM. And he wanted it fast because he was new to that situation. And he also wanted to meet teachers as well as school leaders. So we had arranged a dialogue for him, all within the 2 months that he was acting Minister of Education. But that was good for the ministry because during the dialogue, that's the first time the dialogue was held with the Prime Minister come the Minister of Education. And that's the first time the Gabungan Majlis Guru Besar and the Majlis Pengetua Sekolah Menengah came together to bring about that event. So can you imagine years of having those two Majlis councils, they've never worked together in, coming up with an event, and that was the first time ever. So in a way, although it was difficult for us to handle because the pace and the change, was so rapid, but then there are also values to it. It created greater cooperation among the Majlis, as I said, and also to bring about those changes also required the cooperation and collaboration from the various divisions within the ministry, as well as other agencies that's relevant to the effort that we are bringing about. For instance, can we bring back science and mathematics in English, teaching of science, teaching and learning of science and mathematics in English? The paper took about 2 weeks, to analyze and bring forth the justification and what are some of the suggestions for improvement. Likewise, for values, we managed to launch within the 2 months that he was in tenure, the civics education. So that can't be done by the DG alone. That has to be with the support of the whole ministry and collaboration with others as well.
This flip-flopping of leadership, and then you have policies. Let's just take teaching of science and math in English for an example. How many times have we seen that change over the years? How would you avoid something like that to continue to happen? And I think that sort of then you start to wonder, yes, it takes 2 weeks to make a decision, but then there's no continuity when it comes to implementation of the blueprint. Dr. Habiba?
So I think it only went once, the teaching of and teaching learning of science and math in English. But then it was discontinued. But in its place, there's the dual language program. It's similar to the PPSMI, teaching and learning of science and math in English. Only now there's a choice by the students to take, instead of PPSMI is a policy that goes across all schools, while the DLP is a program. So schools can opt, and that would also depend on the choice by the parents for their children, whether to take the DLP program or not in the schools that are offering the DLP. Schools can only offer if they have that capacity and the capability to implement the DLP. So in a way, it's good because the PPSMI also, the stress is also on schools that can't do it because they do not have the resources, in particular the teachers that can teach the science and math in English. So that's a huge stress on the system, on the schools. So although the ministry has provided resources, for instance, the notebook, as well as the training, but then again, it goes at the same time as the rollout of the PPSMI. So whether teachers have actually developed themselves, for instance, that is an issue because some have not, and they are still grappling to teach the science and math in English. But with the LP, for instance, with that choice given and the necessary requirements, it's only when the teachers are able to teach the subjects in English that the schools can offer. It's only when parents choose that their children go into the program that they are and placed in those classes. So in a way, it is an improvement to the PPSMI because it's now tailored to the situation, to the context of the schools.
Puan Khadija, how do we look at big picture delivery? How do we avoid or be critical of the numbers that are coming out in terms of performance? How do we stop patting ourselves on the back thinking that we've continued to only do well? How do we hold people accountable when it comes to performance?
I believe at the end of the day, you need to see what are the outcomes that we have delivered so far. Like I've said earlier, not all outcomes have achieved its targets, but we also need to see what are the issues that we need to do more so that we can accelerate some of these initiatives that we have planned all these years. People are working hard, that I can assure you. But however, at the end of the day, working hard alone may not give you the outcomes that you would like to see. So that's where sometimes we get criticism because people cannot see the outcomes. However, sometimes also I feel the sad thing is there are a lot of good stories out there as far as achievements are concerned within the Ministry of Education. But unfortunately, those stories have not been showcased. Like if I can take an example of teachers, for example, there are many, many, many unsung heroes all over, especially in the rural areas, but nobody knows. So that is why, as you would be aware, recently we had that teacher, Cikgu Samuel, right, who even almost got the global award. So that's one example, but it's only one. There are many, many more. So it's important also, I think, apart from taking criticism positively so that we can work on those areas and continue to improve. But we also need to celebrate the many achievements and the great effort that has been put in. That has not been a lot, I think. It's always looking at things have not, gone well. But there are so many that have gone well. So I think if we have a balance, then maybe it can give us a bit more motivation. Because if everything is gloom and doom, then it's difficult for us to move forward.
But we have to be realistic and hold people accountable. How do we do that? Can you hear me?
Sorry?
Yeah, how do we hold people accountable?
Well, that is currently being looked at as well, I think, in the ministry, and like you mentioned earlier also for the leadership change and all that, we also in Padu had a lot of problems with that, because every time we have a leadership change, we need to start the learning curve again. I think within the professional side, it's not too bad because everybody is pretty involved in the blueprint. But I think from the PTD side, because sometimes they come from another ministry, so they are not well aware. So you need a lot of effort to put them on a learning curve so that they understand and they can provide the support that's needed. So those were I wanted to interject earlier, but yeah, so that's also one of our challenges in terms of the changes that's happening.
Dr. Habiba, interministerial, interagency collaboration is so important. That how well is that going? Is that a challenge when it comes to implementation of the blueprint?
Okay, I think slightly before that, to just pick up from what Puan Khadijah said. I think we do have to acknowledge the successes that we've seen. But then again, to uplift the whole system, we need to be more ambitious, I think, because ultimately it's not a matter of just looking at those individual schools, but then, overall, how can we lift everyone up so that no one is left behind? But when you also mentioned about accountability, I believe that it's already inbuilt in some of the programs that we see. For instance, the district transformation program, while we are supporting schools and the districts, but then also we also have that component of making them accountable. That's through the performance dialogue and how they meet those KPIs that have been set through negotiations with them. And that system of accountability has also put in place at the key leadership positions. For example, the minister, the DG, the KSU also have KPIs which are not just those linked to administrative, but also to what is important for, since we are in the Ministry of Education, what is important for education, like participation, how many students are already involved in STEM, how much have we expanded vocational programs, and so on and so forth. So that's part and parcel of the accountability on those key leadership positions, and that is cascaded down to the district as well as to the states. So how well people are delivering is already taken into account, I think. And we also have put into work process the weekly reporting of how we are meeting milestones. But I think more importantly is to sustain and as well as to have that rigor for the mid-year review as well as end of year review. Because I remember at the earlier years of the blueprint implementation, it was a huge process during the mid-year review and end of year review. Because the mid-year review is to look at how far you have gone halfway through and what do you need to do in order to achieve the end of year target. Likewise, the end of year target is important for you to see how successful you are and how do you then re-strategize to move forward in the following year, because your ultimate targets for your aspiration will not change, it's fixed. But how you go about doing it is through these various review processes and re-strategizing. So I think that is most important from my perspective. Working other, sorry.
No, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, working with other ministries, I think the Ministry of Education has had a lot of collaboration and cooperation with other ministries. I remembered holding many meetings and coming up with various efforts together with other ministries. So I think that's not so much of an issue, but perhaps in terms of there's seldom uh, shared KPIs, I don't know, across ministries. It's individually owned by the ministries. So even though, for instance, we have this vocational program and we have a lot of vocational providers, but then again, the ministry sets its own KPI for what it wants to achieve in the provision of vocational education, for instance. So yes, we do speak, we do engage with other providers, but then how do we look at the whole landscape of providing vocational education and training as a whole? Perhaps that's a challenge when we say about working together. Yes, we do talk, we do discuss, and we do set our individual KPIs, but then as a whole, at the national level, how do we go about doing it? I guess that's when that's the challenge.
You know, I've always wondered, why is it the ministry just didn't open up its doors and collaborate with community initiatives? I mean, you have people like Teach for Malaysia, you have people like Leap Ed, you've got tons of people working in the education sector which complement the work that you do. Why is the ministry hesitant to collaborate more with these people? I mean, they're on the ground, they understand things, they can help you out so much more. Why isn't that more of that happening? Dr. Habiba?
I don't think that it's not happening. It does, but I suppose if we want to go on a big scale, that's when the challenge comes in. Because when we speak about LIPED, for instance, they are part of the trust school, the service provider for trust school, and that's where we learn about the successes, the advantages of the trust school, and that's where it's transformed to the TS25 or Transformasi Sekolah 25, which is carried out by the ministry. I guess because based on the modeling itself, moving from trust school to the TS25 by the ministry has taken into account the successes of the trust school. It's a workable model, but then again, it's kind of expensive. The modeling is expensive, so the ministry wants to expand this successful model at a faster rate and at a more reduced cost. Whether it will bring about the same successes, that we have to see on the ground, and how far it has progressed. So it has started quite early and the numbers are expanding. I think that is yet to see. But then again, in moving to TS25, we leveraged on LIPED as well, because they have been the service provider for the trust school and they are the best in terms for us to engage. But having learned from DPED and from the success of trust school, the ministry then takes upon the ministry in order to run the TS25. But that doesn't mean that there's no room for these various agencies and to support what the ministry is doing and to come up also with new initiatives like, for instance, there is, besides the DTP, there's also the Aman project in Kedah, which again, we have seen successes. But it's also an issue with the community, the people on the ground. For instance, while some are better at understanding it, some also see these different projects as isolated from each other, whilst it should be integrated as seen as a whole package, because after all, they are supposed to support schools and the district in terms of how we can improve school and student performance. I think ultimately that's the goal. But then again, people tend to look at things in packages and not as a whole. So the messaging, the communication, as well as trying to understand how these various projects do come together and we can leverage is also another important component besides leveraging on these providers that you have spoken, like LIPAD, in terms of supporting the districts, the schools, the ministry.
Yep.
I think
Ladies,
apart from that, we are also enhancing the cooperation with the corporations, and that's part of the 11 trust, which is trust number 9. More and more corporates are now aware what are some of the initiatives in the ministry, and they have come forward, I think, to work together. And we are now also trying to reach out to find out what are their interests and their agenda so that we can support them. So it's a two-way relationship. And that is happening now more than it used to be before. So I don't quite agree that, that the ministry is having reservation. I think we are more than happy to welcome whoever who would like to collaborate and support education.
as I'm listening to the both of you, I think you need strategic communications initiatives in a big way. A lot of people don't understand. I would think, and I'm guessing corporates would think, this is the government's work. Why do I need to come in and fund this? It's government's responsibility. For an example, that could be the thinking. How do you dispel some of those misconceptions and help them to understand it a lot better? Could be a way forward. Ladies, we're running out of time. Khadija, what would you do differently if you could implement the blueprint all over again?
Well, I think I would insist on having a sustained commitment as far as funding is concerned, as far as support is concerned. That must be confirmed for the long run. That is one of the issues I think that we are facing, because different leaders will have different agenda, and the other one would be, I agree with you totally. I wanted to mention that I think we lack in effective strategic communication, and the last point would be on risk management. I think a lot of the issues that we are also facing is because there's a lack of risk management. If that can be further strengthened, maybe it would help.
Dr. Habiba?
Yeah, I think we have a very good blueprint, I think, because we not only look at the local context, but also we learn from how other systems are doing it. So for me, it's rightly the commitment from the topmost or the key leadership right down, to the JPN PPDs as the school. And that commitment has to be sustained throughout the journey of the blueprint. And to keep the sustainability and the rigor of it, because the blueprint is definitely ambitious. The targets set are so ambitious. So if there is a slack or if there is a shortfall, we may not be able to achieve the target set. So that means not doing business as usual. We need to do things differently. Some are strategic, some are operational, but definitely, be it strategic or operational, it needs to be done differently. So whether we have that rigor in pursuing that, it may be the cause of the shortfall that we are seeing now. So we only have less than 5 years to go. So I think it has to be brought back. Why are we doing this? How are we going about doing this? It's important. And everyone has to play its role. It's not just being committed, but the role that you need to understand the role you play at your various levels and the contribution that you can make. For instance, a good example is what you say, the involvement of other people in supporting what the ministry is doing. So I think it's not a matter of just creating that awareness. I think the ministry sporadically have done it in saying, okay, we need this, why we are doing this. These are some of the areas that we need support. But then again, to go beyond that creating awareness, because the awareness may die off. You need to sustain, to develop people's interest, to contribute, and to continue contributing. And whether the ministry is having that platform, is having a channel that ease people into supporting, supporting the ministries, even if they are aware and they want to support, but it's so difficult to access. I want to contribute, but how can I contribute? why is it so difficult to contribute? That will deter those people who have got good intentions to help the Ministry of Education. So I think one is the commitment from the top right down. Two is perhaps to ease ways on the involvement of other people to support the Ministry of Education. And thirdly, I think, yes, I agree that the communication is very important, whether, we are doing well, the successes that we have gained, as well as, what are the shortfalls, and perhaps, that will garner the support from other people as well, when they understand that we have these challenges, we have these issues. So everyone needs to play their part, and what part can they play in terms of helping us to achieve the ambitious aspiration that we have set.
Thank you, ladies, for joining us today. Dr. Habiba Abdul Rahim, former Director General of Education, and Khadija Abdullah, former CEO of PADU, the Education Performance and Delivery Unit, discussing the implementation of the Malaysia Education Blueprint 2013 to 2025. And this has been from a government's perspective, from two individuals who were in government in the past. So join us in our next webinar, where we will be discussing the moving forward from 2025. Is the Malaysia Education Blueprint still relevant? Do we need a new blueprint, or do we look for the political will and resources to make it happen? Be with us Thursday, 23rd of September at 6 p.m. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.